There is no policy area that is not impacted by housing. I don't know why there isn't more outrage about any of this. It's just the Wild West out there. I'm Vicky Spratt, the iPaper's housing correspondent, and I'm here to answer all of your burning questions about Labour's landmark Renters' Rights Bill. This is a once-in-a-generation shake-up of the housing market. First question. To what extent do you subscribe to the housing theory of everything? That's the idea that excessive property prices have adverse consequences on a vast swathe of other things. Well, I'm not going to say I coined the housing theory of everything, but I think I coined the housing theory of everything. And yes, I do subscribe to it. I don't think there is any policy area in this country, or indeed any other country, which is not impacted by high house prices and high rents. If you think about it, it feeds into everything. And I wrote about this in my column yesterday. Why do we have so many people returning to prison after they've been released in the UK? Because there isn't safe, secure and affordable housing for them. And actually lots of inmates say that they'd rather be inside than homeless. If you think about child poverty and the impact that has on children's life chances, that links to poor quality housing and high rents and poor quality accommodation and rising homelessness, which is caused by those high rents. I really believe that lots of the strain on the NHS is related to bad housing as well. We know also that people who are in hospital often can't be discharged because they don't have a dry, warm home to go to. We have even had some CCGs, that's a clinical commissioning group, which is basically a bit of the NHS, it's how it's carved up financially, prescribing heating because it will be more cost effective to put decent insulation and heating into people's homes than to have them sick and in hospital. There is no policy area that is not impacted by housing, and I think that high house prices and high rents pushing more people into precarious situations has had a knock-on effect on every single other government department. This is a very interesting question. Given the new limit on how much upfront rent can be paid, do you know if there's any provision for student renters and other renters who don't have steady income or a guarantor? So this question links to something that I reported exclusively the other week, which is that in the new Renters' Rights Bill, the new Labour government are going to cap the amount of rent that landlords can ask for up front. It's a huge problem, and since the Tenant Fees Act 2019 banned letting agents from charging enormous deposits, rent up front has kind of become this loophole where landlords can get an enormous amount of cash from you before you rent a home. And the problem is that it shuts people who don't have that cash out of the rental market. So like low income people, people who rely on state support to pay their rent, and actually students, right? So I think this question is like, how are we going to protect people who might need to pay rent up front, or who landlords won't now accept because they don't have a guarantor? I think landlords will just have to get on with this. So I think ultimately this is a good thing. But the concern about what it will mean for low-income people and whether landlords will be less likely to take them on is justified, and let's see how that plays out. I like to think this will be a leveller, but if we know anything about some landlords, not all landlords, there are some good landlords, it is sadly that they don't always do the right thing. This is a question that I ask myself on an almost weekly basis, actually. Why is there so little outrage about the number of homeless children, the return of hotbedding, and the fact that most house shares meet the definition of unacceptable housing? Yeah, I don't know why there isn't more outrage about any of this. We have got a historically high number of homeless children at the moment, and by historically high I mean since records began of children in temporary accommodation. And temporary accommodation is the housing that you go to if you've been evicted or made homeless. Hostels, B&Bs. I've also visited like converted office blocks and porter cabins where homeless families with kids are being housed. It's not somewhere that you want to end up. Why is there not more outrage about that? Or the fact that lots of people live in house shares now which are overcrowded or maybe not up to the standard that there should be? I think it's because everybody knows the housing crisis is bad. And people sort of have outrage fatigue. How many times can you read a shocking statistic about the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of homeless children before eventually you become numb to it? Lots of people don't have a choice. We all need somewhere to live. I remember when I lived in a flat share in East London, and my friend and I still joke about it because our bedrooms were actually one bedroom and they were divided by an MDF wall in the middle. We didn't want to live like that, but it was all we could afford to be where we wanted to be, and we just had to get on with it. And I think if you let yourself be as outraged as you actually are and feel the anger, you wouldn't be able to get up and go to work in the morning. This is a question that I think it's really important to interrogate, because I'm hearing a lot of people talk about this at the moment. Some people have suggested that the Renters' Rights Bill has led to a lot of landlords selling up. Is this a thing? Yes and no is the answer to your question. The Renters' Rights Bill will regulate the private rented sector for the first time since the 1988 Housing Act, deregulated it and put new legislation which favoured landlords into the housing market. This is a really important shake-up, and I think lots of the measures in the bill, soon to become the Renters' Rights Act, are vital, protecting people from eviction, limiting how much rents can go up by and how often, banning discrimination against renters on low incomes and who need benefits, state support to pay their rent. I think all of this is long overdue, and it needs to happen because we currently have more people living in privately rented housing than we do in social housing. But is it true that this legislation is making landlords sell up? Now, I've not seen any compelling data on this. If anyone's got any, I'd love for them to email it to me. I think some landlords have been selling up since the pandemic. We certainly know that that's true. Is it because of the Renters' Rights Bill? I'm unconvinced. I think it made financial sense in some cases for them to sell up. And those who are selling up because of the bill, again, we don't know how many of them there are, but let's assume there are a fair number. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it might be a good thing for the housing market if some landlords sell up. Homes don't disappear when they are sold, they're bought by other people. They might be bought by other landlords, or even better, they might be bought by owner-occupiers, first-time buyers, people who are upsizing. All right, don't hold back. How do you see the future of housing in the UK playing out? And what do you think your solution would be to fix the mess that is the housing market in the UK? I mean, that's a big question, but I'm going to take the first part first. I think what happens next really depends on what the Chancellor Rachel Reeves does in the spending review. I wrote in my newsletter today, in fact, my latest newsletter, about what might happen if she gets her way and regulators loosen the restrictions on banks lending to first-time buyers. Ultimately, that probably would be good because it would make it easier for first-time buyers to get credit, and it would rebalance the housing market a bit because they'd be able to buy homes, which has been very difficult since 2008 because of restrictions on how much banks can lend to people with small deposits. And I think the Renters' Rights Bill coming in at the same time as that might see some people who are currently renting get onto the housing ladder. That's kind of like the immediate future, but the longer term really depends on how quickly Labour can build new homes and how many of them are truly affordable social housing. And I think there's a bigger sort of atmosphere in which everything and anything the Labour government do is going to be impacted, and that's the global sort of like macroeconomic environment. President Trump just took office again. We've still got uncertainty around the world with various conflicts. There's a climate crisis. There were just enormous fires in LA. All of this feels unconnected to where we are here in Britain, but the reality is that it does impact the global economy. It impacts the cost of borrowing. The second part of this question, what do I think the solution to the mess that is the housing market in the UK is? Well, it's not my job necessarily to have solutions, but to tell you about lots of experts and their different solutions. And I suppose it really depends on who you're talking to. If you're a YIMBY, that's a yes in my backyard person who's very pro-house building, the answer is supply, 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 build more houses, build more houses. But if you are Professor Josh Ryan Collins of the UCL, Public Policy Institute, who I was sharing a talk with earlier. It's redistributing the housing that we do have and making sure that it's affordable. I think I probably fall somewhere in the middle. I think we need to build some new affordable homes, but I think there is a lot to be said about the homes that we do have and who owns them. Part of the Renters' Rights Bill involves preventing agents and landlords from accepting offers over the advertised price. What do you think the likely immediate consequences of this are going to be? That's a great question. So just quickly to recap on the problem, I haven't been a private renter for about 6 years, but when I was renting, I remember going to properties in London and being asked to put a bid in an envelope, and there were queues sometimes of like 10, 20 people. We were all outbidding each other. That makes it really hard to find a home that you can afford to live in, because you basically don't know how much it's going to cost after you viewed it because you thought you could afford the price on the listing. And my colleague sitting next to me just told me that she paid £400 more than the listed price for her flat. I mean, it's just the Wild West out there. So I think there are two things to say about the consequences of stopping this practice of basically asking people to bid to secure a home. One, it will stop people bidding and stop agents asking them to secure a home. Long term, I think that's probably a good thing, and it will even out the renting market. Short term, there may be a negative consequence, which is that landlords will list properties slightly higher because they know they can't ask people to enter into bidding wars. Now, that's probably going to be reported along the lines of Labour's Renters' Rights Bill causes rents to go up. That's inevitable, but I think you have to look at the medium term and long term implications of the new legislation, not just what happens in the immediate aftermath. Finally, I'd also argue landlords are already putting rents up in anticipation of this, so maybe point 2 has already happened. You can check out my writing over here, my weekly column and my newsletter at inews.co.uk.